that Geoff is ex-environmental agency, Rivers Authority, postgraduate to Cambridge University, the full works, a true expert within the field, and we're very blessed and very honoured and very humble, should I say, to have you on board with us and to be able to talk to the team members. So thank you very much, and I'll probably just hand it over to you, and then we'll go with questions afterwards.
That's fine. I'm going to share screen. So hi everyone. Hope you've had a productive morning, and this is a bit of a break with a cup of tea and a sandwich whilst you're having your lunch. I'm just going to move over to my desktop over there, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. So just bear with me. Okay, so hopefully you're able to see that slide now. Sarah, just to confirm, if you can just confirm that's visible to everyone. Yeah, all got some thumbs up, brilliant.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. Well, first of all, thanks very much for the kind words, Sarah. It's a privilege to be part of such a innovative hackathon. This is my second hackathon and first one done online in this way. So really looking forward to hopefully helping the teams think through their challenges. So I'm going to run through some basics around flood risk. So my experience of flood risk goes professional and personal. So I myself was flooded on bonfire night. So that's November the 5th, 2000, where a lot of surface water ran into my house after basically a month's worth of rain fell on the hillside behind me. It went in the back door and out the front, and there was no flood warnings or anything like that. I just had to mop up and deal with it, and it caused huge psychological effects on myself and my family, because every time it rained, you just felt your house was going to flood again. So the impact of flooding is really very, very deep, very personal, very emotional for those that are affected. And then professionally, I was as Sarah said, I was in the Environment Agency, and in my latter years, I was involved with strategic planning. So where do you put houses, i.e. not in the floodplain? But of course, with changing climate, the floodplain is going to change. And we've damaged the floodplains in so many ways since we've been using rivers for transport and for power and so on. We've modified our environment to such an extent that the natural connected floodplain just isn't functioning in the way that it used to. And I'm not an engineer, but I've worked with many, and so part of my job has also been working on a degree program at Brunel University, which I shared yesterday a little taster slide deck. So if you still want to know a bit more, there's a slide deck you can look at, which is free of charge to go through to help you understand kind of what is flood risk. And it seems quite a narrow area, but actually it's immensely complex and very broad. And so I'm really interested to see what the teams will come up with in terms of addressing some of the challenges. This is by no means fixed as an issue. You know, there are professionals involved with it, yes, but there are so many potential areas for innovation that are going to take us forward to help protect people and property, livelihoods, infrastructure, whatever it might be. And we know against the backdrop of a changing climate. So the first slide here has got two images which I think are really strong. So to the left, you've got that car floating down, effectively the high street of a place called Boscastle that was hit with a major flood in 2003. Remarkably, nobody died, but there was it was a massive emergency evacuation issue there. Lots of caravan sites nearby and camping areas. Suddenly, this deluge hit this very narrow, steep-sided catchment, and it just ran straight through the town of Boscastle. And some of the cars got washed away. They never found them. They went out to sea. So, you know, the impacts are this happened in a matter of hours. And the second one is really the bottom end of a catchment. This is Tewkesbury Cathedral. It's like an island. So back in the Middle Ages, they knew where to build and how to build. So they built at the highest point of the area to avoid the I think it's River Severn, River Wye that go past those areas. So, you know, we're talking about this has been known for a long time, and yet we still seem to be building into problems. So just what's driving in this change in the context of climate change? I've got a couple of indicative slides here, and there's a lot of science behind this. I'm just going to touch on this, but essentially, with global warming, what we're finding is that the sort of the hot zone around the equator is the engine room for a lot of weather for the whole of the planet. In the UK, we're most familiar with really the storms coming out of the sort of Gulf of Mexico and out through the Panhandle and then across the Atlantic, where we have these things called hurricanes. But essentially, you've got this sort of intense heating of bodies of water, which is then causing turbulence into the air, and that does a number of things. And I'll just touch on that. But I wanted to really show you here is that, you know, we think about tropical storms. These tropical storms don't stay in the tropics; they do move. And as we've seen from even hurricanes that start off in the Gulf, you know, at sort of 5 and 6, they lose their wind energy, but they are still highly energetic weather systems, and they move across the Atlantic, and we're being hit by those in the UK and over into Ireland as well on more frequent basis. So we're getting much bigger storms and with much more energy. So that's a climate issue. The next one really is, this came from a project called Ice to Sea, which really talks about what they call return periods. So how frequent are we going to get damaging storms? And with a combination of sea level rise and also these large intensive weather systems, which I'll come back to, the frequency of this return periods of storms of a certain severity is only going to increase over time. So the bottom line is kind of where we are now with current sea level and current storminess. But as sea level goes up by 0.5 meter, which we will see within this century, maybe more, you know, the energy, even with current energy, you will have a lot greater likelihood of these major storms impacting on our coastlines. And with greater energy, you know, something that maybe a 0.1% happening in any one year is now going to be a 1% or 10% chance. And that's the backdrop. We're dealing with weather systems that dump a lot of rain, but we're also dealing with a lot of high energy weather that's then driving the coastal impacts, which I'll touch on now. So I mentioned this heating effect, and the expectation is that as warm ocean water continues to warm, that drives up convection currents, and those airstreams are warm as well, so therefore they're going to carry a lot of moisture. As it gets to a certain point, that energy, that's all the water then condenses, but the energy is still there, and you end up with these things called supercells. And this is where we're seeing greater strength hurricanes. They're more 4s and 5s than there have been ever before in the last sort of 10 years. So we're seeing these high energy systems then becoming supercharged with wind energy and with water, this turbulence, and then these storms then move around, obviously moving from the origins in the tropics, but then they're moving forward into more temperate zones. I'm afraid are going to hit our country. And what's also interesting and changing is that we've got the storm tracks are different, and that's often driven by something called the jet stream. And in more recent years, what we're seeing is that these storm tracks with high pressure over the Arctic area, the storm tracks have been pushed further south. You know, we've had record flights back from America over to the UK, and it's driven because these jet streams are more in the zones where the aircraft are flying. And that means that these storms track across in more southerly areas. So historically, Scotland and Ireland, and to some extent North Wales, would have received these major storm events happening on a more frequent basis. These storms are now traveling further south, and it's on the track often between what we call the Severn Estuary and the Wash on the east coast. And that means we're getting bigger weather systems traveling further south, and that's causing major impacts on infrastructure that really wasn't built to design it. And then with those low pressure systems, you get this bulge in the sea level. And what that's doing, that helps you create a storm surge. So when you look at that middle diagram there, you're going to get the low pressure enables the sea to be higher. And so on top of a normal astronomical tide, you will also have the ability of the water level to be higher because of the atmospheric pressure being low. And that alone with the sea level rise and then also with the turbulence is going to mean that we're going to have a lot more impacts from storm surges on the coast. So again, the climate change is changing to give us a lot of rain, but it's also giving us the rain impacts in locations we haven't had before. So we had record rainfall up here in the east of England on the 2nd of October. A storm just sat over east of England and dumped, you know, basically a month's worth of rain in a day. And think about also this about the extremes. It's not just about aggregate amounts of water falling, it's the extremes. We're getting intensive rainfall systems, particularly in the summer, but also now in the winter periods. So that's also another driving factor. I'm going to canter through this slide a little bit because it's a bit of an animation, and I'm going to share the slides afterwards, Sarah, so everybody can look at it at their leisure. But essentially, before you start looking at flooding, you look at what they call the antecedent conditions. So what's the nature of the land we're falling on? What's the land use? Is it farmed land? Is it forested? What sort of soils have we got? Does the water going to be penetrating into the ground, or is it just going to run off? And something called soil moisture deficit, which I apologise for the jargon, but what that's talking about is how dry is the soil. So what's the ability for that soil to absorb water? If it's saturated, as you understand, it will just run off. Equally, if it's baked hard, the water will just run off. So what you're looking for really is, to build up a wet soil, essentially is little rain and often is what you're looking for to then recharge groundwater levels. So I'm just going to run through the animation. Essentially, as rain falls, what you're going to find is that the river is going to rise. It will then go what they call out of bank, so it'll go into its natural floodplain. It will go on to farmland. It will go into grassland. Grassland, the water should sink into the soil. With agricultural land, what you'll find is that you'll expect that water then to run off, and what you'll have then is water coming back from the land back into the river, and that's going to bring in sediment, and that sediment will then be dropped downstream. So the brown arrow means it's carrying a sediment load because you've had field washout, and that's also going to block up your rivers and you need to dredge that out at some point. So that's going to leave you with some other problems coming down the catchment. The water then runs back into the catchment as the water subsides. But then you're into the other issue then is, well, okay, we've now got a floodplain. What have we done to the floodplain? Have we built in the floodplain? Can we keep the river within a certain boundary or river corridor? And that's where flood defences come in, because what people will then do is build defences to protect the built environment that may be in that lower part of the floodplain. And I mentioned also about storm surges. What you may have, in some cases, you may have what they call a fluvial flood, so water coming down the catchment. And that could also be met with a storm surge coming up the estuary and into the river system. Then you end up with, in effect, a tide locking system. And that happens where I am in the Norfolk Broads, which means the water can't get out. And so the water will hang about for a fairly long time. So recovery can take a fair while as well. And so they're the sorts of predecessor conditions that might influence the scale of impact and the extent of impact and how long the impact goes on for. So we've talked about the antecedent conditions and so on, but the sources of flooding, well, clearly intensive rainfall will be a likely cause of flooding and runoff. Surface water runoff. So when we're talking about intense rainfall, where does that go? Well, eventually that water will end up in the river, at the bottom of the catchment. It'll go into streams and then rivers and so on. But of course, it's got the rainfall has to get from where it's falling into the river, and it may be that you end up with surface water runoff in streets and hard surfaces. It happened to me. It ran off through my house, not round it. So what you're also then expecting is that the rivers will then slowly rise. And what people don't realise sometimes is you don't get a flood warning when you've got surface water happening. The river hasn't risen. The flood warnings are based on water courses. They're not based on rainfall. Very, very rarely is it a rainfall alert. So warning and informing people is a challenge. People may have already been flooded before the first flood warning is issued, and as you might imagine, they feel left behind in that. Over long periods, groundwater will recharge and then will start to come up through the ground, and groundwater flooding can last for months. Once the aquifer is refilled, you get artesian water pressure underground then finds its way up, and you find this water coming up. And then, as I mentioned, we've got tidal and storm surge. In some cases, we also have snow, and obviously, large amounts of snow eventually will melt. Obviously, in alpine regions, they're used to it. This is what happens. They deal with the snow melt in the spring. But in this country, we tend not to be so good at managing extremes of weather like snow. And as a consequence of that, we don't always think about, well, what's the snow going to then do when it melts? And it's about a 10-to-1 ratio of, so 10 inches of snow equals about an inch of water in terms of rainfall. But often snow melt is met with a rainfall event. It's warming up, snow is then melting, and you get the combination of the water that's already in the catchment but not actually in water in terms of water, but then also melting and adding to the flooding. So there's, depending on the weather, you also have a range of other potential impacts, and that's the in combination effect. Right, so that's a very, very quick canter through what is flood risk, and I think I've already alluded to the training that slides that you can look at to give you some understanding of that. So I guess one of the people now, well, who are the problem holders and the stakeholders involved with flooding? And it could be any of us, to be honest. So, well, and kind of what part of the problem are they holding? And if you're looking at innovating for solving a problem, then it's really, well, who are the people you're trying to influence and help here? As I said before, flooding is not fixed in any shape or form. So who are they? Well, it's people like you and me, it's communities, it's householders. Community flooding is a disaster for that community, not just when it happens and in the recovery phase, but for many years to come. And in the news, you'll hear about a community being flooded, and that name will be synonymous with a flooded community, and that can lead to long-term deprivation, a rebuilding the houses. There's a fear factor, but also businesses to invest. So, you know, when a community is flooded, it can be a major challenge for the local authorities to help move that community forwards to a new reality. So it's the people, and I will start with the people. Then we look at people who are responsible, in effect, for managing and helping communities deal with flood risk. And we have two challenges in Wales and Scotland. So here we have SEPA, Scottish Environmental Protection Agency, and Natural Resources Wales are the statutory authorities responsible for a range of issues around flood risk management. So warning and informing, building and maintaining defences, and maintaining sort of the asset base that's there. But also there are major asset owners, so critical infrastructure, so water, electricity and rail. The bottom two photographs there really bring it home that, you know, we have assets and they get swept away or damaged. The rail line to the southwest of England, when it was cut off, caused, you know, huge economic impacts to people in Cornwall and Devon because their artery to the rail, because of the Dawlish impacts that had happened after the coastal surges of 2013, really meant that you know, they had no ability to move people around or goods. And indeed, the recent rainfall that happened in Scotland that led to the dreadful rail disaster was a landslip that then led to the rail line being cut off. So we look at existing infrastructure, how resilient is it? And then we've got landowners and farmers and developers, so people wanting to build build new developments. We need new houses, but how do we build flood protected or flood resilient houses, and how to make sure that we're not building in the wrong place in the floodplain? And there's legislation around that, but if you look at any image of a flooded community, you'll find there are houses there. So posing a question to you as the teams here is, how does your tool or concept or product help these people become more resilient? In what way is that going to help them? This will be one consideration you might want to be thinking about. And as I said, this is a very fertile ground for development. And some of the problem elements in terms of flood risk, well, kind of what part of the problem are you looking at? And here's some examples. And I'm going to point you to my last bullet, which is what else? And having been involved with this for many years, my mind is very closed. I'm looking for people who are bringing something different. So what part of the problem are you dealing with? Are you predicting where flooding might be now and in the future? So a flood risk map at the top right is an example of that. Can you do that better in a different way? How do you warn people? Behavior change and warning is an absolute fertile area here. People don't act. Equally is a risk of crying wolf. How do we engage people to know you own this problem? How do we help you be protected at the right time, protecting your assets? And people always get caught out in any flood, despite the warnings that are given. Can we protect people in a better way, whether that's on a temporary basis? So the middle picture there is about temporary flood defences, protecting a street near a river. There's no natural defence there. Can we manage water better on a catchment scale? And I'll turn on to that in a moment. Future proofing. How do we ensure that community has a vision of what it wants to be in the future, living with flood risk? How do we do that? And that envisioning the future piece, that bottom photograph of a flooded London in 2050, if there wasn't a new Thames barrier, for example. How do we bring this to life so we take the right actions forward? And I think you could tackle any of those and something else to help move this forward in a way that we're going to have to adapt to a very different flood future than we've had. So last slide really is, you know, we talk about the problem, but there may be other opportunities that might arise around flood risk, and this integrated thinking piece I think is really interesting. So we talk about flood. Flood is an excess of water. It leads to you know, problems. It leads to damage. But of course, rivers receive water, they've always flooded. It's the natural nature of things. But equally, we've also got extremes of weather with wetter winters and drier summers expected through climate change. How do we turn flooding in and to mitigate something else like drought? So what might you want to be thinking about in terms of storage of excess winter water, and indeed through the summer storms that are going to be these large intensive systems that arrive? Is there something that you could be thinking about that brings in other benefits? The second one down here is that wider environmental outcomes. So if by wetting land, you create a sequestration for carbon opportunities. So you have aquatic plants, they die, they fall into the water, they sequester the carbon, they lock in carbon. So how does what you're planning to do here, perhaps does that contribute to net zero? Can you build something in a different way or a different material, using waste materials possibly, that might reduce the build carbon or operational carbon? If you go to a natural capital environment, the carbon in build and the carbon to operate should be very low. And that could be very attractive now going forward with our mitigation agenda. What you might want to do, and there's lots of examples now coming through of communities doing a range of environmental initiatives that are also helping to reduce flood risk. So holding back the flow, slowing the flow down a catchment using either re-wetting land so it absorbs better the water when it falls, or planting trees to allow water to go into the ground. They might be also of interest. And again, that might be allowing you to bring in biodiversity benefits, which should also be looked at here. And then the final thing here, and this was something that I think is particularly pertinent to the hackathon, is how you engage people. And you might be working on channels that the statutory authorities don't work with. So can you create, or do you have reach that engages people that other actors involved with flood risk management don't seem to use? And I think there are huge opportunities here for working differently. And with our digital age, I'm not going to give you some ideas here, but I think there is an opportunity where you could do something quite different compared to what the statutory authorities are doing and make a difference. And this is my last slide. I just want to bring it home to everyone. Really, this was a real event in a place called Crickhowell in Wales. I know we've got a Welsh group working on this. Had a month's rainfall in 48 hours. No resilience measures going to deal with that. So we are dealing with extremes of weather. Yeah, everybody will remember Storm Dennis, who lives in Crickhowell, because it will be one of those things that will extend beyond the life of living memory. It'll be written in. It'll be on marks on walls. It'll be maybe some plaque somewhere. But this is very real for people. And some of those houses are quite old. If you're looking at that photograph, they're not new builds. So this is a real challenge for them. And also notice that there's a big green bank running through the centre of the town there. And that, I imagine, is a flood defence. As you can see, the water's gone round it or behind it, and it's causing problems. So there we go. I'm going to finish there and stop sharing my screen if I can. So how was that?
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. I've my mind, even from what you've gone through so far, is just going off into so many different directions. And I think we all know that the flooding in the UK is a problem. We all know that. We've seen it on the news. We've seen it coming up recently that that's the case. But I think what you've certainly done, and I'll sort of take the guidance of everyone who's listening in. I think one of the things I've certainly learned from this is that there's so many different ways in which we can try and tackle this. But then that's also a big problem with that, because there's not one solution. And the whole journey from it, I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head about, think about the user, think about the end person. And there is so many options that you can look at, as you mentioned, about whether it's alerts, is it how you actually do that, is it prevention? And this is where, to actually, for a hackathon purpose, we can't save it. We can't do any of it all in one weekend. We can't even run with one concept really all in one weekend. But it's about really pinpointing that one section that we think is potentially the most urgent right now. That's probably, and I know some people have put this out into some of the questions, is how how easy could this be implemented, and how quickly and how cost effective this could be. Because I take it, Geoff, is it the local authorities that pick up the bill from this? Is it the insurance companies, combination of both?
Yeah, I mean, that's the matrix of who's involved. I mean, the community response is very much owned by the local authorities, what they call upper tier or lower tier, so county or unitary authorities. They are there to help get that community back to some sort of normality, whatever that normality is after a major impact like that. Yes, and as you might imagine, with COVID, they're going to be very, very, very stretched. So their resources are going to be run down. Sometimes governments will step in and add, there's what they call a bellwin payment. So extra money comes into the local authority, and often they can claim for that. So after prolonged storm, weather, flood after flood after flood, they just clear up for the last one, then the next one comes in. Right. And it doesn't have to be as big as the last one, because the first one's done all the damage, and you've got damaged defences, or you've got very wet ground and so on. But yes, the responsibility for all the community response is down to the local authorities with a range of other partners, and that's the blue lights, that's the fire, police and ambulance and so on. The asset owners, so Network Rail or the water companies, electricity, are supposed to be able to make their assets resilient, but obviously there's a huge cost to them, and obviously as us, we'll be parting that from our bills. The Environment Agency has a sort of warning and informing and maintaining major defences on what they call main river, but there are other authorities. So if you're in a low-lying area like the Fens, for example, there are what they call drainage authorities, and they have responsibilities. But broadly speaking, somebody somewhere is responsible for your water course in terms of maintenance, in terms of then helping that community bounce back as best they possibly can.
Okay. And we've got, again, even with what you've just mentioned, I think we could just do a hackathon by itself. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, we put 8 potential challenges out there. We should have just stuck with potentially one and maybe run a series with it, because there's so much. There is so much to look at, isn't there?
There is. What I'm interested in is that different thinking. And as I've said several times, this is just because there are authorities involved or there are already existing organisations doing things, does not mean that we have solved this thing of flood risk management. So I think if the teams are working on a particular element of the flood problem, that's fine. It's going to take many different components to of course. So yes, it is overwhelming, this potentially for everyone perhaps on this going, well, I didn't realise it was quite as big as this. But actually, in one sense, it doesn't matter. It's about different thinking. It's about how the tools, the Internet of Things, a whole range of things can be applied to take elements of this problem and say, we can do something differently with that. And that's where I think there's huge excitement in what the teams could be looking at here. And something as mercurial as behaviour change, anything that's going to help people act in the teeth of a flood, you think they do, but they don't. And it's baffling to me. So is there something?
And even just looking at that, and again, as I said, trying to explain, and I know that between yourself and I, we will go through each of the teams and we can ask them if they, if they do require any help, etc. But even when you've just said about, the rescue side of it potentially, or how quickly they act. But what you can also do is really then pinpoint that down. Do we look at the elderly? Do we look at the impaired? Which category within that? And this is what I would sort of back up with what you've said, Geoff, is really try and concentrate on one area for this particular weekend. Concentrate on one. You can't go the whole hog, and look at how that can be different. What makes your product or your solution or your concept unique? What makes it different? How is this going to turn people's lives around, and as quickly, whether that's financially, whether it's emotionally, etc. But there's definitely help that's needed to be done. Is there any advice that you could give to any of the teams?
Gosh, where do you start? I guess don't be tied back by the current systems and processes, what's gone before. As you can see, it's we do, the people who are involved with this are immensely earnest, and they do their very, very best. And if there are flood professionals on this hackathon as mentors over, you will know that this is this is becoming difficult to do because of a changing climate. So
yeah,
what weather we've had in the last 100 years is almost irrelevant now. We're looking at a projection, as some of the slides said. This is going to be different going forward. So the you know, the engineers, I'm involved with training, professional training for them, and I just go, you know, you can talk to people who look like me in the sense that they're in their 50s, probably got a lot of grey hair, but in one sense, their experiences are almost irrelevant now because your paradigm is so different to what they were dealing with. So pick the bits that are relevant for what's going forward, and then reimagine your future with this challenge ahead. And what would you want to? What tools might you want available? What tools do you think people might want that's going to help them be more resilient going forward?
Yeah,
so it could be something really targeted, but it could be so impactful. You know, around things like the fear of flooding, or you mentioned vulnerable communities, and that's a perfect example. How do we really enhance, particularly at the moment with COVID, where everybody's particularly in Wales right now. So, you know, how do you deal with flood risk in a COVID? I mean, that's something we've never thought about before. Well,
it's very real, so very real. Yeah, and that's not just those who are trapped, but that is, like you've mentioned, the blue lights, the emergency services, and this is all linked. And this is, you know, this has happened once. The likelihood it will happen again in another life. Well, hopefully not in ours, but maybe in another lifetime. So it is something that we do need to look at as a disaster recovery solution.
My last 3 slides, I know they were focused largely on the flood risk environment, so to speak, but I think for the teams who aren't involved with flood risk, maybe listening in, any members from this, just think about there's some reflective points in there about stakeholders and customers and so on. How does your product align to them? Where do you get added benefits, multiple benefits from some things you're doing, and the opportunity piece, you know. So for me, that, you know, define your problem really clearly in the wider context of flood risk or whatever it might be, and then go, that's what we're going to work on. And trust me, I bet you people might have done some of these things before, but no one has done it the way that we'll be doing it. And I think that's where the fun is and the excitement is. It's innovation and creativity. So
yeah, that's brilliant. Does anybody have any questions? Because I think I could just have a chat with you for hours, and I wouldn't let anybody else.
I've got a question which is related to the issue of liability when commercial entities are involved in flood risk management in the UK. From my understanding, local government and national government is absolved of liability in taking actions under best endeavours measures. If a commercial entity is involved and perhaps is managing a flood element on its own without the involvement of either local or national government, has thought been given to how that risk is managed for the commercial entity being engaged?
So an example might be something like what they call a third-party asset. And the answer to that is I don't know, and that's displaying my ignorance. But I don't know whether that's even been. I'm sure it has been thought about. I know in natural flood management thinking, where people are saying, well, we're going to put a green solution in, and so we're going to plant a lot of trees, or we're going to put some beavers up here, or we're going to put some what they call leaky dams. So as the water cascades down the catchment, you end up with the flow being slowed up and holding water back. Who owns those assets? Who goes back and maintains it? Who makes sure it's going to work and will be in what they call condition? And that is a very real and live debate at the moment. And it's you know, where you can build something out of concrete and steel, people could go, well, I know that won't fall over. They do occasionally, but not as much. When you're building something out of bits of wood and trees and relying on 4-legged animals, you know, to build your beaver dam, how do you know that's going to work? And yeah, I know that is coming in that context. I can't remember about third-party assets, whether the asset owner has to take some sort of liability insurance against, you know, a failure, the sluice falls over, drops the water down. No, I think that's quite an interesting area that if you're exploring that, then great. I think that could be something really of interest to people about how you build up a solution to that. Great question, Stephen.
Thanks.
Anybody else have any questions? Anybody else? I think everyone's just digesting. As I said, it's a minefield, isn't it? It's an absolute minefield that once you actually for a team to come together, as I keep, and I know you've reiterated this as well, for a team to come together for one weekend, you kind of need to start now looking. It's 12:30, you know, around about 100% by 4 o'clock. We need to get your, you know, what you want to work on kind of nailed, so that we can get that ready for the presentation and the intro and everything else for tomorrow. But there's just so much, there's so many off spins, there's so many ways in which we can go down that route, and then to dissect that through again, that's something that we need to be looking at. But Geoff, I believe that you're online for a while during the course of today. If there's any questions as well, and we can easily book people in for mentoring sessions too, not just with Geoff but with the other mentors. So I'm going to leave you guys to it. Let's enjoy your lunch. Hopefully enjoy your lunch and give us a shout. And thank you very much, Geoff, and I'll speak to you this afternoon again. Absolute pleasure. Thanks everyone for listening. I'll share the slide deck. That's amazing. Thank you, Geoff. Thanks very much. Bye. Bye.